The money came slowly at first. It wasn't like in the movies. It was sweat. It was the constant low-grade hum of anxiety that lived in the back of my throat. Our first office was the corner of our living room, the carpet worn thin from my pacing. I remember the smell of cheap coffee and the heat of the computer monitor on my face late into the night. Wed sit there side beside him, with his technical drawings spread out me, with the spreadsheets. The numbers never added up. Not at first. My job was to make them add up, to find a way. The signs were there, but I didn't want to see them. The extra hours at the office, the new password on his phone, the vague answers to simple questions. I found the receipt for the jewelry I never received, a pair of earrings from a boutique I'd pointed out in a magazine, saying how beautiful they were. He'd remembered. But not for me. The discovery itself was so mundane. It was a text message that popped up on his iPad while he was in the shower. A name I didn't recognize, a heart emoji. The rest was a blur of strength I didn't know I had. My fight was no longer just about my own heartbreak. It was about defending the world you had so bravely chosen. We built a new life after that. It was different, of course, quieter. The apartment felt too big with just the three of us for a while, but we filled it. We filled it with a different kind of noise, the sound of us talking, really talking for hours, the sound of you and your brother arguing over the radio station again. We didn't have European vacations, but we had Saturday mornings at the flea market, hunting for treasures. We didn't have a big house, but we had a home that was built on something solid. We had respect. We had the unshakable knowledge that we had faced the easy temptation and chosen the harder, better truth. I heard about your father, of course, through the grapevine, the big house, the new wife, the constant stream of expensive things. But the reports always had a hollow sound to them. He had everything he thought he wanted, but he had lost the only thing that actually mattered. He lost his witnesses. He lost the people who saw him not for what he had, but for who he was, and without that all the money in the world is just noise, a distraction from the silence of an empty house. You taught me that the true legacy isn't what you leave in a will, it's what you build in the hearts of the people. You love. Your father left us an inheritance of absence. But you and your brother, you gave me an inheritance of presence, of loyalty. You redefined what wealth means. We are rich in a way that no market crash can ever touch. We have the memory of who we were, and the truth of who we chose to be, and that, my darling, is a fortune that compounds every single day. The title of this chapter is a strange one. I know most people would hear the story and think the opposite. They'd assume the money was the whole point. But they'd be wrong. The money was just the trap. The escape was something else entirely. The loss of self erased in his shadow. It happens so slowly, you don't even notice. One day you're a person, with a name, with opinions, with a favorite brand of coffee, and a silly laugh. You aren't ashamed of. The next you're an accessory. You become the billionaire's wife. At first it sounds glamorous, doesn't it? It's a title people whisper with a kind of awe, but a title is just a label on an empty jar. My dreams were the first to go. I used to paint, not well, but with passion. My studio was a spare room filled with the smell of turpentine and the joy of making a mess. That room became a guest room for his international clients. The canvases went into storage, which eventually became a donation to a local school. My hobbies seemed trivial next to his ambition. Lunches with friends were replaced with charity galas, where I was expected to sit quietly and look impressed. My opinions on politics, on art, on anything really, were gently sanded down until they were smooth and inoffensive. Darling, that's not really the angle. He'd say, or perhaps a more diplomatic approach would be better for the brand. The brand. Our life became a brand. Frantic, sickening, scrolling photos, hotel reservations, words he hadn't used with me in years. I remember the specific moment I realized I had vanished. We were at a dinner party, one of those impossibly sleek events, in a penthouse with views of the entire city. A woman I'd just met turned to me and said, "You must be so proud of everything he's built." And I just smiled and nodded. But inside, a cold little voice asked, "What about what I built?" There was nothing left to point to. I had built him. I had been the support structure, the quiet counsel, the steady hand that held his world together while he reached for the stars. But the scaffolding isn't celebrated once the skyscraper is complete. It's just dismantled, forgotten. The betrayal, when it came, wasn't a surprise. In some deep hidden part of me, it was the final logical step. He didn't leave me for another woman. Not exactly. He left me for a concept, a younger, more photogenic, more strategically connected concept. She was another accessory, a newer model. And in replacing me, he confirmed my greatest fear, that I had never been a partner at all. I was just another asset. and my value had depreciated the ultimate erasure. He replaced me with a symbol. Very superficial world I had slowly been consumed by. It was the final act of dismissing everything. I was everything I had sacrificed. I the awakening from anger to clarity. The anger was a nuclear fire. It was all-consuming for weeks. I was just pure white-hot rage. It was all I could feel. It was better than the alternative, which was the crushing emptiness, the sheer humiliation. The anger gave me a purpose. My purpose was to hate him, to dismantle him, as he had dismantled me. My lawyers were sharks, and I wanted them to feast. I wanted the houses, the cars, the stocks, every last penny. I wanted it to be a public spectacle, a humiliation that matched my own. Anger burns clean, and eventually it burns out. There's a moment when the flames die down, and you're left sitting in the ashes. And it's very, very quiet. That's when the real work begins. The lawyer's letters piled up. The mediation sessions were a grueling theater of grievances. And one morning I was reading through a 50-page document, outlining his arguments for why he deserved to keep a particular investment portfolio. And I just started laughing. It was a hollow, tired sound. This was what my life had become: arguing over numbers on a screen, spending my days, my energy, my spirit fighting over the remnants of a life I never really wanted. The decision didn't come in a dramatic flash. It seeped in like dawn light. I was sitting in my temporary apartment, which was small and quiet and entirely mine. I had started reading again, real books, not just headlines on a financial tablet. I'd bought a cheap sketchbook and some pencils. The lines were shaky, but it felt good. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. I realized that by continuing the fight, I was still letting him dictate my life. I was still orbiting his sun. Every hour spent on that legal battle was an hour I wasn't spending on myself. He had already taken so many years. I refused to give him any more of my time. My peace became the most valuable currency, and I decided to take it. The confrontation happened in the kitchen, under the cold glare of the halogen lights we'd chosen together. There was no denial, no drama. That was the most shocking part. He was calm, resigned. Almost. He said he'd been unhappy for a long time. He said he'd found someone who vibrated on his frequency, someone who understood the man. He was now not the man he used to be. She was 25, an intern at the firm that handled our PR. She was, he said, uncomplicated. I called my lawyer and told her I wanted to settle quickly, cleanly. I didn't need to win. I needed to be free. The look on her face, I could hear it even over the phone. She thought I was crazy. She thought I was giving up. But for the first time in a decade, I felt like I was claiming a victory, my victory. The rebuilding a foundation of self. So I walked away with a fraction of what I was entitled to, and it felt like a fortune, because it was mine, because I had chosen it. The first thing I did was find a therapist who didn't care about net worth. We talked about me, not about the divorce, but about me, the person who had been buried. We excavated old dreams, old hurts, the girl who loved to paint and hated fancy parties. I reconnected with friends I hadn't spoken to in years, the ones who had fallen away, because they didn't fit the lifestyle. They didn't care about the divorce settlement. They cared that I was back. We drank cheap wine and talked for hours. I traveled, but not to 5-star resorts. I went hiking. I felt the sun on my face and the ache in my muscles. And it was real. It was my ache, my sun. The small venture I started wasn't anything he would have understood. It's a tiny online shop where I sell pottery. I make it myself in a small sunlit studio. I rent. It's messy and unpredictable. The glazes sometimes do strange things. But every imperfect bowl, every lopsided mug, is a testament to a choice I made for myself. It's not profitable, not in his terms, but it feeds my soul in a way that no dividend check ever could. The simplicity of it, the authenticity, is a constant joy. It's the opposite of that oppressive, perfect luxury. I used to live in. That life was a gilded cage. This life is an open field. The true fortune, peace, and purpose. The realization didn't come from a mountain top or a meditation retreat. It came on a Tuesday while I was wedging a lump of clay, my hands covered in gray mud. I looked around at my little studio, at the shelves of my quirky, imperfect creations, and I felt a sense of calm so profound. It was almost dizzying. My power was never going to be in a bank account. It was in this, in my resilience, in the ability to get knocked down and decide consciously to build something new and entirely my own. It was in my creativity, my spirit, that he could never touch, never own, never quantify. I saw him about a year later. It was a complete accident. I was leaving a coffee shop, and he was walking in with a group of men in identical suits. We almost collided in the doorway. There was a moment of stunned silence. He looked older, tired, still sharp, but in a worn-out way, and he looked at me, really looked at me. I wasn't dressed for an event. I was wearing jeans with a smudge of clay on the knee. My hair was a mess. And I saw the confusion in his eyes. He was waiting for me to look diminished, bitter. Then came the dismissal, the real betrayal. I asked him what he thought we had built together. What about all those years? He looked at me with a pity that was colder than anger. You helped, he said, the words like little shards of glass. You were a great support system. But let's be honest. This was always my creation, my vision. You were just along for the ride, he said. He'd be fair, of course he'd give me a settlement. But the company, the assets, the fortune, that was the work of my life. The sleepless nights, the idea. Defeated, but I wasn't any of those things. I felt light. I smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. I said, hello, Robert, just that, no anger, no resentment, just an acknowledgement. And the look on his face was the final piece of the puzzle. It was surprise, yes. But it was more than that. It was a dawning understanding that I possessed something he could never acquire. His money could buy him islands. But it couldn't buy him the peace that radiated from me. It couldn't buy the purpose I had found in a lump of clay. His surprise was the final confirmation. I had won, not the way the world keeps score, but the only way that truly matters. The greatest revenge isn't taking something from them, it's giving something back to yourself. It's living a life so well, so authentically, so joyfully on your own terms, that their entire concept of victory becomes meaningless. I didn't want his money, I wanted my power back. And I found it in the quiet moments, in the messy studio, in the rediscovery of my own name. I am not the billionaire's ex-wife. I am the woman who remembered how to build herself a life from the ground up. And that is the only fortune I will ever need. The wine was always good at book club. That was the one constant, that, and the comfortable silence that fell when we were all settled in Sarah's living room, books open on our laps. But the real stories were the ones we were about to tell each other this night. Though the silence felt different, it felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I remember the glass in my hand felt dangerously fragile. I was looking at my reflection in the red liquid, trying to find the words I'd practiced in the mirror all day. The room was warm, but I felt cold. Claire was talking about the novel, something about the protagonist's resilience, and I just broke. It wasn't a loud break, it was a quiet shatter. I set my glass down on the coffee table, the click of crystal too loud in the room. He's leaving, I said. My voice didn't sound like my own, it was flat, hollow. And he's taken everything, or he's trying to. The accounts are frozen. There's a letter from his lawyer. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that absorbs sound. I could feel their eyes on me, but I couldn't look up from the pattern on the rug. Then came the sounds, a sharp intake of breath from Sarah, a quiet, furious no from Maya, the rustle of Claire shifting closer to me on the sofa, her hand finding mine. It wasn't pity in their touch, it was solidity and anchor. And then the questions started. But they weren't the vague, sympathetic questions I'd gotten from others. These were precise, surgical. Maya, the lawyer, her voice instantly shifting from friend to advocate. When did you receive the letter? What exactly does it say about the assets? Have you spoken to him directly? Claire, the therapist, was watching my face, not just listening to my words. How are you sleeping? Are you eating? And Sarah, with her razor-sharp financial mind, was already pulling a notepad from her bag. We need a list, every account, every investment, every property you two held jointly. We start there. That saved us all, was reduced to me being along for the ride. He had rewritten our history, so completely, so finally, that I felt like a ghost in my own home. The book club meeting evaporated in its place. A war council convened. The novel was forgotten on the floor. Sarah's elegant coffee table became a desk littered with notepads, pens, and a laptop she produced from her study. The mood in the room transformed from one of comfort to one of fierce, focused energy. The shock was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But it was now surrounded by a warmth. I could physically feel their anger was a tangible force. But it wasn't a reckless anger, it was a fuel. They were taking my chaos, my devastation, and they were beginning to assemble a structure around it. A plan. My pain was being translated into a strategy right there in that room. By the collective intelligence of the women who knew me best, they saw the battlefield before I even knew where to look. That was the beginning. The revelation wasn't just that my husband had betrayed me. It was the immediate, unwavering rallying of my support system. They didn't just offer a shoulder to cry on, they rolled up their sleeves. Maya was the general. She took the lawyer's letter and dissected it with a cold fury that was magnificent to behold. This is a scare tactic. She set her finger tapping a specific paragraph, there hoping y'all be intimidated into a quick unfavorable settlement. We are not intimidated. She handled all the communication with his legal team from that point on. She'd call me after a particularly nasty email from them, and her voice would become steady. I've dealt with worse than this in a single afternoon. He thinks he's hired a pit bull. He has no idea she worked pro bono for me, a fact I fought her on, but she just waved a hand. This is what the sisterhood is for. Well, send me a fruit basket when it's over. Then there was Sarah, my financial detective. She came over one weekend with her laptop and a determined look. We sat at my kitchen table for hours, a table where it hosted so many family dinners now covered in bank statements and spreadsheets. We're going to follow the money, she said, every single dollar. She showed me things I never understood, hidden accounts transfers I'd signed without reading the true valuation of our investments. She had a way of explaining it that made it feel less like an overwhelming tragedy and more like a complex puzzle we were solving together. Look here, she'd say, pointing to a line item. This transfer to the Caymans happened 6 months ago, right around the time he started working late. So often her work wasn't just about numbers. It was about uncovering the timeline of the lie. She gave me back a sense of control piece by piece. Claire was my anchor, while Maya and Sarah fought the external battles. Claire fought the internal one. She was the one who knew when to stop talking about legal strategy and just make me eat a bowl of soup. She'd show up unannounced with groceries, or just to sit with me in silence, while I processed it all before every deposition, every meeting that filled me with dread. She was on the phone. Remember your breathing, she'd say. You are not the one who did anything wrong. You walk in there with your head high. You are stating facts, not defending your character. He has to defend his. She reframed my fear into strength. She was the voice in my ear reminding me of who I was, separate from the mess he had created. And the others, the wider circle, they formed a protective barrier around my life. They took turns calling me every night, so I was never alone with my thoughts for too long. They organized a schedule to drive my kids to their activities. When I was too exhausted, they brought meals, they sent flowers, they texted me jokes in the middle of the day. It was a network of care, a web of support that held me up when I couldn't stand on my own. The numbness lasted for a week, then the anger came, a clean, sharp, clarifying anger. It was the most powerful thing I'd ever felt. It was fuel. I called a lawyer, a woman whose reputation was legendary. I walked into her office, and I laid it all out, not just the emotion, but the facts, the documents. I went back into our old emails, our hard drives. I found the original business plan, the one with my comments in the margins. I found the drafts of the Anders proposal, the one I had written. I had. The victory, when it came, was shockingly swift. Maya called me one Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was bright, clear. It's done. They've folded. The settlement is better than we could have hoped for. She explained the terms. And I sat down right there, on the kitchen floor, the cool tiles against my legs. It wasn't just the money, though. Securing my financial future was a profound relief. It was the principle. He had expected me to crumble. He had expected a fight against one overwhelmed woman. What he got was a fight against a united front, against Maya's legal brilliance, Sarah's financial forensic skill, Claire's emotional fortification, and the sheer unyielding force of our community. I learned later from a mutual acquaintance that his lawyer had complained about my formidable team. He was surprised, they said, by the coordination, the expertise, the sheer lack of weakness he could exploit. He couldn't compete with that. He was one man with a hired gun. I was an army of friends. We celebrated, of course, but the celebration wasn't at some fancy restaurant. It was back in Sarah's living room, the site of our first war council. There was wine again. But this time the mood was electric, joyful, triumphant. We toasted each other. We toasted Maya's strategic genius. We toasted Sarah's detective work. We toasted Claire for keeping me sane. We toasted the entire circle for their unwavering support. The victory wasn't mine alone. It was ours. It was a testament to what happens when women lift each other up instead of competing or tearing each other down. We had turned my personal crisis into a collective triumph. In the quiet after the celebration, I started to think the fight was over for me, but I knew my story wasn't unique. I knew there were other women sitting in rooms, just like I had been feeling that cold, isolating shock, without a Maya or a Sarah or a Claire to turn to. The gratitude I felt was so immense it needed an outlet bigger than just thank you notes. That's when the idea began to form. I used part of the settlement to start a foundation. We called it the boardroom, a nod to where my own salvation was truly plotted. It's a network that connects women facing similar crises with the professional help they need. We have a roster of lawyers like Maya financial advisors, like Sarah therapists, like Claire all who volunteer their time or offer reduced rates. We host workshops on financial literacy for women, on understanding their legal rights. We've created a community, a modern-day support system, for when the traditional structures fail. Final reflection, the one that stays with me every day, is this: a partner can betray you, they can take things you thought were secure, they can try to dismantle your life. But the right friends, the right community, they don't just help you pick up the pieces, they help you build a new empire, they provide the blueprint. And the manpower, the foundation of this new life, isn't built on sand like the last one. It's built on the bedrock of loyalty, of mutual respect, of shared strength. That book club didn't just help me reclaim my fortune, it helped me discover a wealth I never knew I had. A year to the day after the divorce was finalized, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a strange time for a notification late on a Tuesday evening. I almost ignored it, thinking it was just another promotional email. But something made me pick it up. It was an email. The sender's name made my breath catch in my throat. It was her, the younger woman, the one he left me for. Kept meticulous records, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Tax returns from years when my income was listed as zero. Because we were reinvesting everything, it was all there, a paper trail proving my partnership. The subject line was just one word: hello. My first thought was pure, unadulterated fury. Was she rubbing it in? Was this some kind of victory lap now that she was officially living in my old house, spending what I thought was my ex-husband's fortune? My fingers trembled as I hovered over the delete button. Every instinct told me to erase it, to pretend I never saw it, to keep that chapter of my life locked away. But a colder, more curious part of me won out. I opened it. The message was hesitant, awkward. It didn't sound like a woman gloating, it sounded scared. She started by saying she knew she was the last person I ever wanted to hear from. She apologized, not for the affair, but for the pain it caused. It felt like a rehearsed line, and I almost stopped reading right there. But then she wrote something that made my blood run cold. She said, "I think there are things you don't know, things about David. I've found out some things, and I don't think I can carry it alone anymore." She asked if we could talk just once. She said she had proof. I must have read that email 10 times. The arrogance of it, to think I would ever want to speak to her, the audacity to drag his name through the mud after she fought so hard to get him. It felt like a trap. But the sheer desperation in her words, the unpolished fear, it felt real against every fiber of my being. I typed a one-line reply: "What kind of things?" She responded within minutes, as if she'd been staring at her screen waiting. She asked if we could meet somewhere neutral, a public place, a coffee shop. She said it was too big for email. I agreed. The following afternoon, I walked into a busy cafe downtown, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw her immediately, sitting in a corner booth, clutching a mug with both hands. She looked different. The vibrant, confident woman from the courtroom photos was gone. She looked pale, thinner, her eyes shadowed with a deep, unsettling anxiety. She looked like a ghost of the woman I remembered. She stood up when she saw me, a nervous, jerky movement. We didn't hug, we didn't even shake hands, we just sat across from each other, a chasm of bitterness and betrayal between us. There was a long, heavy silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper: "Thank you for coming." I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She took a shaky breath and began. She told me that the fairy tale ended almost as soon as it began. The lavish spending stopped. David became secretive, paranoid about money. He did get angry over small expenses. He started taking business trips that didn't make sense. And she found the first bank statement. It was hidden in a file. He told her was old tax documents. It showed an account I never knew existed, drained almost to zero. When she confronted him, he spun a story about a bad investment, promised it was temporary. But she started digging. She's better with technology than I am. I'll give her that. She accessed his cloud drive, his email backups. And that's when she found the real story. The fortune, the business empire he'd built, the life we had. It was. The legal fight was brutal. He fought dirty. His lawyers painted me as a gold digger, a hobbyist who dabbled in the business to pass the time. They said any contribution I made was as a wife, not a business partner. But we had the evidence. We had the emails I'd sent to investors, the contracts I'd negotiated. My lawyer was a pit bull. She deposed his new girlfriend, who had to admit she knew nothing about the business, its history, its struggles. She just enjoyed the benefits. House of Cards. She opened her bag and slid a thin folder across the table. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were printouts of emails, financial transfers, loan documents. At first, it was just a confusing jumble of numbers and names. But as I read, a horrifying picture began to form: secret loans taken out against the company, loans he never disclosed during the divorce, inflated valuations presented to the court to minimize my settlement. There were transfers to another woman's account dating back to before he even met her. Her name was Sasha. The affair with the woman sitting across from me wasn't his first. It was just the one he got caught in. The room seemed to tilt. The chatter of the coffee shop faded into a dull roar. I looked up at her, and I saw my own shock reflected in her eyes. The man we both thought was a titan of industry, a self-made success, was a fraud, a con artist. He hadn't just lied to me. He had built his entire life on a foundation of deceit. The business was leveraged to the hilt, the assets were smoke and mirrors. The divorce settlement I fought so hard for, the one that felt like a hollow consolation prize, was based on fraudulent numbers. He had stolen from me twice over: first my marriage, then my fair share. I felt a wave of nausea. All those years I spent building a life with him, supporting his dreams, believing in his vision. It was all a performance. The vacations, the cars, the charity galas, it was all funded with borrowed money and lies. The humiliation was a physical pain. I had been so blind. But looking at the woman he left me for, I saw she was just as much a victim. He'd sold her a dream, too, a dream that was now collapsing around her, burying her in debt and legal jeopardy. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. He's not who we thought he was, she said, her voice cracking. And if this all comes crashing down, I'll be left holding the bag. I am named on some of these loans now. I think we need to do something. And in that moment, the dynamic between us shifted irrevocably. The jealousy, the anger, the bitterness, it didn't vanish. But it was overshadowed by a cold, clear shared purpose. We were no longer the wife and the mistress. We were two people who had been systematically manipulated and cheated by the same man. A strange, pragmatic alliance was born right there in that coffee shop, forged not in friendship, but in a mutual need for survival and justice. We started meeting secretly. It was awkward at first, all business, wed exchange documents in a library, talk in hushed tones in parking lots. We pooled our evidence, my knowledge of the business from the early days, the legitimate parts I had witnessed combined with her digital sleuthing, and her access to his current financial panic. Piece by piece, we built a case, a timeline of his deceit. We discovered he had a second family of sorts, a network of shell companies and secret accounts he used shuffle money around. The scale of it was breathtaking. The victory wasn't dramatic. It was a line in a legal document, a percentage, a number transferred into an account with my name on it. But it was a number that represented justice. It was my years of labor quantified and returned to me. It was the court officially acknowledging what he had tried to erase, that I was not a passenger, I was an architect. We consulted a lawyer, a fierce woman who specialized in fraud. She was horrified and fascinated by what we brought her. She said we had enough to not only reopen the divorce settlement for fraud, but to potentially trigger a criminal investigation into his business practices. The poetic justice of it was not lost on any of us. The two women he had pitted against each other, the ones he thought he had defeated and discarded, were now united. We were going to become the architects of his downfall. The legal process was slow and brutal. He fought back, of course. He accused us of collusion, of being bitter and vengeful. But the evidence was overwhelming. The emails he thought were deleted, the financial trails he thought were hidden. It was all laid bare. Seeing him in the deposition room, stripped of his bluster, facing the cold hard facts of his own lies, was a satisfaction purer than any I had ever known. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. It was about pulling down the facade he had hidden behind for so long, and exposing the cowardice and corruption at the core. In the end, the settlement was overturned. I received what I was truly owed, a sum that was life-changing and secure. His business empire built on lies did indeed crumble. Debts were called in, investigations were launched. The fortune he used to lure her away evaporated. The final court hearing felt like an exorcism. As we walked out of the courthouse, for the last time, she and I stood on the steps for a moment. The sun was shining. We didn't hug, we didn't promise to stay in touch. She looked at me, and there was a quiet respect in her gaze. Thank you, she said. It wasn't a thank you for friendship, but for the alliance for seeing it through. I nodded, take care of yourself. And that was it, we went our separate ways, we aren't friends, we don't meet for coffee, the bond we shared was situational, born from a common enemy. But I have a profound respect for her. She had the courage to reach out, to face her own humiliation, to help bring the truth to light in doing, so she freed us both. I moved to a new city, I built a new life, a quiet one, on a foundation that is entirely my own. The money is a comfort. But the real prize was the clarity, the knowledge that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts about him in the end were right. The universe has a strange way of balancing the scales. Sometimes justice doesn't come as a thunderbolt from the sky, sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of an email from the last person you'd ever expect, delivered by the hand of the very person you thought was your rival. Karma's methods are mysterious, but its aim is perfect. He had to sell a part of the company to pay me. It diluted his control. The last I heard, the new wife, the young one, is spending the money as fast as she can, and he's left with a relationship that has no foundation, no shared history of building something from nothing. It's a relationship based on what he has, not who he is. I bought a smaller, brighter apartment overlooking the water. I sit there in the mornings with my coffee. In the silence is mine, the life is mine, the money is mine, and the peace, the deep. He had the vision I'll give him, that he could see the product, the machine, the future. But a vision doesn't pay the rent, a vision doesn't negotiate with suppliers, or calm down a frantic investor. That was me. I was the bridge between his brilliant, chaotic mind and the real world. I was the one who learned the import regulations, who figured out the tax breaks, who stayed up until 3 in the morning, rewriting the business plan for the 10th time. Because the bank needed just one more version, I wore the same profound peace of knowing that I fought for what was mine, and I won. That's the real fortune. He thought he was trading me in for a newer model, but he was the one who lost the engine. I am the one who's finally truly free. The silence in the house after he left was a physical thing. It had a weight to it, a density that pressed down on the air, making it hard to breathe. I'd walk from room to room, and the only sound was the echo of my own footsteps on the hardwood floors. We'd picked out together 23 years. You build a life, you build a business, you build a future, and you assume you're building it on a foundation of granite. You never stop to consider that it might just be sand, that one day he could come home, sit across from you at the dinner table you've shared for 2 decades, and calmly explain that he's found something newer, something that better fits the image he has for himself now. And just like that, the life you knew is over. The feeling wasn't just sadness, it was a complete and total demolition of my self-worth. It was the gut-wrenching certainty that I had been assessed and found obsolete. The internal monologue was a vicious, relentless loop. It whispered that I was too old to start over, that my best years were behind me, spent propping up his ambition, that the business savvy I possessed was only ever an accessory to his own, that I was just the supportive wife in the background. I felt discarded, like an old piece of furniture that no longer fits the decor. For weeks I moved through the days in a fog. I'd find myself standing in the middle of a room, having forgot what I went in there for. The world had lost its color. Everything was just varying shades of gray. The turning point came from a place I didn't expect. It wasn't some grand moment of inspiration. It was a flicker of pure, unadulterated anger. I was cleaning out the home office, our office, and I found a stack of old business plans I had written in the early days, plans he had dismissed as too risky, too niche. I held those papers in my hands, and I remembered the fire I had back then, the ideas, the passion I had buried, all of that, to help him build his safer, more conventional venture. And where did that get me? Sitting alone in a house that felt like a museum to a life that was no longer mine. That spark of anger was small, but it was hot. It was the first real feeling I'd had in months. That wasn't despair, and I held on to it. I fanned it. This wasn't about fighting him, about getting revenge. This was about fighting for the person I used to be. The one I'd left behind. It was a fight for myself. I looked at those old plans, and I saw the gap. The market had changed, evolved, in a way that made my Onsenish idea suddenly seem prescient. While he had been playing it safe, doubling down on the same tired model, the industry had shifted. I saw an opening, a need that wasn't being met. This wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a personal one. It was the idea I had always believed in, the passion I had suppressed for the sake of our partnership. Now, there was no one to dismiss it, no one to tell me it was too risky. The only voice that mattered was my own. Startup phase was unlike anything Id experienced before. When we built his company, it was a joint effort. But the vision was always ultimately his. This time, every decision, every detail was mine. And I worked with a ferocity that surprised even me. This wasn't just work, it was therapy, it was survival. I wasn't building a company, I was rebuilding myself. I used every ounce of that hard-won business acumen. But now it was directed by my own intuition, my own vision. I knew the pitfalls, I knew. Two suits for years, rotating them, so clients would think I had a full wardrobe. We poured every cent back into the company. Vacations, those were a myth. A nice dinner out was a celebration, a single glass of wine shared over a table covered in invoices. The common mistakes startups make. Because Id watched him make them, I built a lean, agile operation. I hired for talent and passion, not for pedigree. I created a company culture that was the antithesis of the corporate Toffee structure. He presided over. We were nimble, we were hungry, and I was the engine. The first year was brutal. There were moments of doubt, times when the old voices would creep back in. But Id remembered the feeling of being discarded, and it would fuel me all over again. The breakthrough came slowly. Then all at once, we landed a client that his company had been chasing for years. We did it with an innovative approach that his team had deemed too unconventional. That was the first sign. Then another. Our growth trajectory started to curve upward at a rate that the industry noticed. We weren't just successful, we were the story. The media loved it. The woman who built an empire from the ashes, from betrayed wife to business titan. They framed it as a comeback story. But for me, it was never about coming back. It was about moving forward into a territory I was always meant to inhabit. I'll never forget the day a major financial publication ran a feature comparing our companies. The headline was something like "David outpaces Goliath: How a Newcomer is Redefining the Industry." The article was full of analyst quotes praising our innovation and our agility. It mentioned his company as the established but stagnating legacy player. I read it sitting in my new office with a view that was entirely my own. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't the vengeful kind I might have once imagined. It was colder, more detached. It was the satisfaction of being right, not right about him, but right about myself, right about the ideas I had believed in all along. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he wasn't taking it well, that the success of my company, my name being the one in the headlines, was a source of deep frustration for him. He made comments about dumb luck and a fluke. There was even a poorly veiled attempt from his company to poach one of my key leads. It failed miserably. Seeing his reaction from a distance was like watching a play. I was no longer in. There was no desire to engage, to gloat. The truth of my success was a far greater rebuttal than any words I could ever say. His jealousy was his own problem to manage. My focus was on my own horizon. Real fortune, the one that no balance sheet could ever capture, was my freedom, the autonomy to make my own choices, to follow my own instincts, the self-respect that came from knowing I had done this alone. My life now is filled with things that are authentically mine. The friends who stood by me, the hobbies Id neglected, the quiet mornings where I answer to no one but myself. I look at the life he has now with his new partner and his stagnant company, and it seems small, cramped, a gilded cage of his own making. My world, in contrast, feels expansive, limitless. Being left behind was the most painful gift I have ever received. It felt like an ending, a sentence. But it was actually a beginning. It was the violent, necessary push I needed to jump off the cliff and discover I could fly. The destiny I was building with him was a constrained one, a smaller version of what was possible. Losing it forced me to reach for something infinitely greater, my own empire, not built for someone else's glory, but as a monument to my own worth. And that is a fortune. That the turning point, the real one, was the Anders account. He'd been chasing them for months, hitting wall after wall. They didn't see the application for his product. One Tuesday, I was looking over their company profile, just their public-facing website, and I noticed something. The founder was a huge sailing enthusiast. His entire philanthropy section was about ocean conservation. I remember looking from that webpage to our proposal, which was all technical specs and profit margins. It was sterile. It had no can never be betrayed or taken away. The prenuptial agreement. It's funny how a single document, a stack of papers you sign on a sunny afternoon, can feel like a distant memory for 20 years, and then suddenly become the most important object in your life. It was presented to me just a few weeks before the wedding. He said it was a formality. His family's lawyers insisted a protection for the business he was building. It felt cold even then. But I was in love, and the future was this bright shimmering thing. I trusted him, so I signed it. I barely read it. That was my first mistake, and it was a mistake I would spend the next 2 years of my life correcting. My lawyer Sarah was the one who found it. The flaw, it wasn't a typo or a missing initial, it was a clause buried deep in the definitions section that outlined what constituted marital property. His lawyers had drafted it with such narrow focus on his initial business holdings, the company he had before we met, that they had inadvertently created a loophole. You could drive a truck through the agreement, was meant to shield all his future success, everything built during the marriage, as his separate property. But the language was sloppy. It only specifically protected the assets listed on Exhibit A, a single page, listing his original fledgling company, everything that came after, every new subsidiary, every investment property, every international expansion that happened after the wedding day. The agreement was silent on it. Was a catastrophic drafting error. But for them, not for me. It meant that the vast majority of what we now called our fortune had never been legally classified. It was up for grabs. But finding the flaw was just the beginning. The real work was in proving that I had a right to any of it. His position was simple, and he stated it clearly in his first deposition. I was the wife. I hosted parties, I raised the children, I provided a beautiful home. But I had nothing to do with the business. I was a supporting character in the story of his success. My job was to build the case that I was in fact a co-author. So we started gathering evidence, and it wasn't about finding a smoking gun. It was about assembling a mountain of tiny undeniable facts. It was forensic. We went through 20 years of my old calendars, my emails, even my text messages. We documented every single time I had flown with him to a crucial meeting, not as a wife, but as a sounding board. I had an instinct for people that he lacked. I was the one who over dinner would point out that a potential partner seemed shifty, or that another had a spark of genuine passion. We found memos I had written long forgotten, suggesting marketing angles or potential brand extensions. I had named 3 of his most successful product lines. It was my idea to pivot the company into sustainable materials after I read an article about environmental impact. Then there were the witnesses. We tracked down his first business partner, a man he'd had a falling out with years ago. He was reluctant, but under oath he confirmed it. He said she was always in the room, not just physically. She was engaged. I remember, once we were stuck on a manufacturing cost issue, and she asked a simple question about the supply chain that unlocked the entire problem. We'd been too close to it to see. We deposed his longtime executive assistant, who testified that for years I was the one she would call when he was being unreasonable, when he was about to make a rash decision out of pride. I was the unofficial mediator, the comm center, that kept the entire operation from flying apart during stressful growth periods. We even brought in the company's former accountant, who stated that for the first 5 years, I was the one who personally managed the household accounts and the business petty cash, ensuring they were meticulously balanced at a level of financial oversight that went far beyond So I rewrote it. I reframed the entire proposal around sustainability, around how his technology could reduce waste in the shipping industry, how it aligned with their core values. I found the language, I found the story. He presented it. Of course he was the face. But when he came home that day, he was electric. He picked me up and spun me around in that cramped living room. We got it, he kept shouting, you genius, we got it. That account was the foundation. Everything after that was built on top of it. Simple bookkeeping. Our entire legal strategy hinged on the concept of equitable distribution. This wasn't about what was written in a faulty contract. This was about fairness. The law recognizes that a marriage is an economic partnership. His team fought tooth and nail to frame everything as separate property, a fortress he had built alone. We argued that I had not just lived in the fortress. I had helped design the blueprints, mix the mortar, and defend the walls. My contributions, while not always unofficial payroll, were indispensable. My work as a homemaker and a mother, which allowed him to work 18-hour days without ever worrying about our children's well-being, had a tangible financial value. My non-monetary contributions of advice, support, and business strategy had directly led to the acquisition and growth of the marital assets. We weren't asking for alimony, we were asking for my share of the partnership. The courtroom was nothing like you see on television. It was mostly quiet, punctuated by the soft tapping of a court reporter's keys. But the tension was a physical presence. His lead attorney, was a bulldog of a man who tried to paint a picture of me as a socialite, a woman who enjoyed the fruits of his labor without ever getting her hands dirty. He asked me in a condescending tone to list my official job titles within the companies. I had none. He tried to make that seem like a confession, but then it was my attorney's turn. She led me through it step by step. She had me hold up a blown-up timeline of the company's growth. And for every major milestone, the first major investor, the launch of the European division, the acquisition of a competitor, I had a corresponding piece of evidence, a diary entry describing the late-night strategy session in our kitchen, an email I'd sent to him with market research. I'd compiled a photograph of me at the ribbon-cutting ceremony standing right beside him. It was calm, it was factual, and it was devastating. I didn't need to get emotional. The receipts, the dates, the specific examples did all the talking. I explained how my role as a mother was integral to his success, how managing a household of that size with his constant travel was a full-time executive position in itself. I dismantled their argument not with anger, but with a quiet, meticulous accounting of my own life's work. I will never forget the day of the ruling. The judge, a serious woman with kind eyes, read her decision aloud. It took nearly an hour. She went through the history of the prenuptial agreement, noting its glaring omissions. She summarized the testimony of the witnesses, acknowledging the credibility of their accounts. And then she got to the heart of it. She said the evidence clearly demonstrated that I had been an active participant in the financial growth of the marital estate. She said my contributions, though not always quantifiable in a traditional salary, had provided the essential foundation that allowed the business to flourish. She rejected his claim that the entire fortune was his separate property. She ruled that the assets were subject to equitable distribution. And in a detailed appendix to her ruling, she awarded me a substantial share, not as a gift, not as support, but as my rightful portion of a partnership I had helped build. Aftermath was quieter than you might think. There was no dramatic celebration. It was a feeling of profound, quiet finality. The most important lesson I took from it all was the absolute necessity of understanding what you're signing. I tell every woman I know, whether they are getting married or going into business, to have their own lawyer and advocate who works only for them. Review every single document. A signature is not just a formality. It is a powerful act if your contribution is non-monetary. And everything did change after that. The money started to come in, not a trickle, but a flood. The first thing to go was the old car. Then the apartment. We bought a house, the kind with rooms. We didn't even have furniture. For his demeanor shifted. With the new address, the collective we of our struggle began to fracture slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. It became his company, his success. He started talking about brand image and market positioning. He joined a new club, started playing golf. The people he document it, keep a journal, save emails. Your work has value even if a society is slow to put a price tag on it. My life now is one I built with the resources I helped create. The financial security isn't about luxury, it's about freedom. It allowed me to start a foundation that provides legal aid to women in similar situations, women who feel trapped by documents they didn't understand and contributions that have been erased. I mentor young female entrepreneurs, and I always tell them the same thing: know your worth, and make sure it is reflected on paper. The legal battle was long and exhausting, but it was also an education. It taught me that the law, for all its complexity, can recognize truth. It can see the value in a quiet conversation, in a nurtured family, in a partnership that exists beyond a balance sheet. I didn't just claim a fortune that day in court, I reclaimed my own story. The feed was a constant polished stream of his new life, him at a rooftop bar, laughing, him on a beach, his arm around someone younger, someone who didn't know the weight of the promises he'd broken. And the captions, they were the worst part: little philosophical quotes about finding freedom, about embracing change, about leaving the past behind. He was rewriting our story, live for everyone to see. And I was just a ghost in his comments section, a silent casualty of his narrative. I had tried to keep up the facade for months, posting a picture of a coffee, a sunset from my balcony, anything to prove I was fine. I was moving on. I wasn't the woman he'd left behind. But every post felt like a lie, a performance for an audience of one, hoping he'd see it and feel something, regret maybe. But he never did. He just kept posting, building his new brand on the ashes of our old life. The breaking point was a video he made. It was one of those motivational ones. He was talking about shedding dead weight to pursue your dreams. He didn't say my name, but he looked right into the camera. And I knew I was the dead-weight me who worked 2 jobs to put him through his MBA me, who stayed up late editing his presentations. Until they were perfect me who believed in him, when he was just a guy with a big idea, and no follow-through. He had built his success on my silence, on my support. And now he was calling me baggage. That night, I didn't cry. I just got very, very quiet. I sat on my floor with my laptop scrolling back through years of my own photos. There I was in the background of his life. Always the photographer, never the subject. There was the evidence of my labor, my love, my investment. And he had erased it all with a few hashtags. I decided I wouldn't be silent anymore. But I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't name-call, I would just tell the truth, the whole unvarnished, boring truth. I would make a video, but not an angry one, a calm one, a forensic one. It took me 3 days. I gathered all the evidence, old photos, time-stamped documents, screenshots of text messages, where I was transferring him money for tuition. I pieced it together like a documentary. I didn't use sad music or dramatic filters. I just used my own voice, steady and clear, narrating the timeline. Brought home were different. They wore watches that cost more than our first year's rent. Their laughter was louder, more performative. I started the video looking straight into the camera. I said, a lot of you have been following my ex's journey to success. It's an inspiring story. But every story has another side. This is mine. And then I just laid it out year by year, the sacrifices, the financial support, the emotional labor. I showed the receipts, literally. I talked about the burnout I experienced trying to prop up his dream, while neglecting my own. I explained how our partnership was never a partnership of equals. It was me building the foundation for a castle he would eventually lock me out of. I was meticulous, I was factual. I didn't call him names. I just presented the data of our life together. The video was 20 minutes long. I knew it was too long for the internet. I didn't care. I wasn't making it for virality. I was making it for me. It was my testimony, my final word on the matter. I posted it and closed my laptop. I felt hollowed out but clean. The first notification came an hour later. Then 10, then 100. My phone started to buzz, a constant frantic hum. I was afraid to look. I thought it was his friends coming to attack me, to call me bitter. But when I finally opened the app, my breath caught. It wasn't hate, it was an avalanche of support. The video had been shared by a few small accounts. And then it just exploded. Women were commenting, "This is my story." Men were writing, "I had no idea. This is eye-opening." The hashtag She the Architect started trending alongside my video. It became less about me and him, and more about the invisible labor so many people, mostly women, perform without acknowledgement. My inbox was flooded not just with messages of solidarity, but with offers. Recruiters from tech companies I admired said they'd been following my ex's career for years, and always wondered who was behind the strategic genius of his early projects. They said, "Now, we know it was you." They wanted to talk about jobs: head of operations, strategic consultant. A literary agent emailed asking if I'd ever thought about writing a book about the unseen architecture of success. A speaking agency wanted to book me for conferences on partnership, equity, and professional development. It was dizzying. Within a week, I had to create a separate professional email address just to manage the inquiries. My personal account was a sea of blue notification bubbles. I'd gone from being a ghost in the algorithm to being the algorithm. I decided to lean into it. I started a newsletter, called it The Blueprint. I wrote about the practical side of what I'd learned: how to track your professional contributions in a partnership, how to have difficult conversations about equity, how to protect your own dreams. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about utility. The newsletter got 50,000 subscribers in a month. Then came the idea for a platform, a proper service. I partnered with a developer I met through one of the recruiters, and we built a tool for co-founders and serious partners to map their contributions: financial, emotional, strategic, and create a living agreement about recognition and equity. We called it the Foundation. It was something I'd needed desperately years ago. I was still there in the background. I handled the finances now on a much larger scale. I was the one who made sure the empire didn't crumble from within. But at parties, at those dreadful cocktail events, he'd introduce me as his wife, and then quickly steer the conversation back to himself. If someone asked me a question about the business, he'd answer for me. "Oh, she keeps the home front running," he'd say with a patronizing smile. My contributions were being edited out of the official history. The late When we launched it, my community was there, they backed the project, they shared it. They became our first users. The business wasn't built on a viral moment. It was built on solving a real problem that my story had simply illuminated within a year. The company was valued in the millions. I was a CEO. I'd sometimes see his posts pop up, they were still polished, still full of buzzwords. But they felt different now, smaller. The comment sections were no longer just praise. People would ask, is this the guy from the She the Architect story? The narrative had permanently shifted. His success now had an asterisk next to it, a footnote that led back to my truth. The strangest part was the lack of anger I felt toward him now. The desire for revenge, to see him suffer, just evaporated. It was replaced by this immense sense of purpose. I was building something that mattered. I was helping other people avoid the trap I'd fallen into. My days were filled with meetings with my team, interviews, planning the roadmap for our product. My life was so full, so demanding and rewarding, that there was no room left for him. The victory wasn't in his downfall. He was still fine, still successful by his metrics. The victory was in my ascent. It was in the thousands of messages I received from people who said my story gave them the courage to have a difficult conversation, to renegotiate a contract, to leave a situation that was draining them. My pain had become a compass for others. True victory, I realized, isn't about burning down someone else's castle. It's about building your own city so bright and so bustling that you forget the old ruins even exist. You look back one day, and the hurt is just a historical footnote, a lesson that shaped you, not a chain that binds you. The past loses its power when the present is so compelling, and the future is so full of your own making. The revenge was never the point, the reclamation was, and I had reclaimed everything, especially myself. My entire world used to fit inside that little kitchen, the four of us squeezed around a table that was always a little too small. The smell of your father's famous spaghetti sauce would fill the whole apartment, and you and your brother would argue over who got the last meatball. We didn't have much, not in the way people usually measure things, but we had a rhythm, a harmony. Your father would come home from the shop with grease under his fingernails, and I'd have your homework spread out next to my lesson plans, and we'd all bump into each other laughing. It was a shared project, our life. We were all building it together, brick by brick. You kids weren't just living in that world. You were a part of the construction crew. You saw me grading papers until midnight. You saw your dad fixing the squeaky hinge on the front door for the 10th time. You saw the effort, and because you saw it, you valued it. That was the foundation, that was our real fortune. I remember the first time I saw you notice the change. It was a small thing. Your father came home with a new watch. It was too shiny for his worn-out work shirt. He made a show of it, holding his wrist out. You were maybe 14, sitting at the table, and you just looked at it. You didn't say anything, but your eyes, they got very still. It was like you were trying to solve a puzzle. A few weeks later, he traded his old pickup truck for a sleek, silent sedan. He said it was a better investment, but you loved that truck. You used to sit in the passenger seat while he taught you how to drive a stick shift, both of you laughing every time the engine stalled. The new car had automatic everything. It felt like a spaceship. It didn't feel like ours. The jokes around the dinner table started to change. His laughter had a new edge to it. He'd talk about people at his new office, the small-time thinkers he had to deal with. He used to be one of those people, we all were. But suddenly our life, the one we built together, started to sound like a story he was telling about someone else's story. He was a little embarrassed by you'd catch my eye across the table, and I'd try to give you a little smile, a signal that everything was okay. But you were too smart for that. You nights the Anders account the years of sacrifice. They were becoming anecdotes. He told stories where he was the sole hero. I felt myself shrinking, becoming a supporting character. In a story I had carrot, the emotional distance grew into a chasm. He was fascinated by the new, by the shiny, and I suppose I was starting to look a little familiar, a little worn, like old furniture. Saw the way my smile didn't reach my eyes. You saw me staring at my plate, a little too long, pushing my food around. You were witnessing the slow, quiet erosion of everything we had been. Then came the night he told us he was leaving. He didn't use those words. Not exactly. He talked about separation, about finding himself, about the pressures of his new position. It was all corporate jargon, words designed to soften the blow. But there was no softening it for you. You stood up from the table, and your chair scraped against the floor. Your voice was quiet, but it shook the whole room. You asked him if his new girlfriend knew how to make his spaghetti sauce. The question was so simple, so specific, it cut through all his excuses. He didn't have an answer. You just turned and walked out, and I knew in that moment that you saw everything. You saw the betrayal not just of me, but of you, of your brother, of our shared dream. The gifts started arriving almost immediately. It was like a siege: a new laptop for you, the latest gaming system for your brother, tickets to concerts we could never afford. He was trying to buy your allegiance, to build a new foundation out of things, instead of moments. I was so scared, I was heartbroken, and terrified that he would succeed, that the glitter of his new world would blind you to the truth. I tried to counter it with love, with stability, but my love couldn't come in a shiny box. I'll never forget the conversation we had in your room. You were sitting on your bed, and that new laptop was sitting on your desk unopened. You looked at me, and you said, "He thinks this is what matters." You didn't sound angry, you sounded tired, wise, in a way that broke my heart. You talked about the watch, the car, the way he now measured everything in dollars. You said, "He's building a house, Mom, but he forgot to pour the foundation first. It's all just going to fall down." You were 16, you understood the architecture of a family better than the man who helped create it. The real test came at that awful dinner. He insisted we all meet, a civilized discussion about the future. He took us to a restaurant where the plates were too big and the portions were too small. He laid out his plan. He had a huge new house. There was a room for each of you bigger than your entire bedroom at home. He talked about private schools, about European vacations. He painted this picture of a golden future. Then he turned to you. He asked you point blank which life you wanted. He put the choice right there on the table, next to the tiny expensive salad. The whole restaurant seemed to go quiet. I held my breath. I was prepared for you to choose him. I would have understood it was a seductive picture. But you didn't even hesitate. You looked him right in the eye, and your voice was clear and steady. You said, "You can keep your house. You can keep all of it. Mom built our character. That's the real fortune, and it's the one thing you can't buy." The air went out of him for a second. He was just a man in a too expensive suit. Deflated. Your brother, who had been quiet the whole time, pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't say a word. He just came and stood next to me. That was it. The line was drawn. You didn't just choose me, you chose everything we were. You chose the crowded kitchen, and the spaghetti sauce, and the shared struggle. You chose the foundation. In that moment you didn't feel like my child. You felt like my ally, my equal. You gave me